want to welcome those in the room and who are online joining us to the Harvard Department's next event in its Historians Speak series, which is an effort by the department to bring an historical perspective to the fast-moving and rather radical events that have taken place during the first months of the Trump administration. Today's speaker is Professor Steven Hahn of the NYU History Department, and his topic is the Trump presidency and Americans' illiberal history. Let me just introduce myself. I am Liz Cohen of the History Department, and I will serve as the moderator for the evening. The plan is that I'll just give a brief introduction to Steve, and then he will speak for about 45 minutes, and then I will ask him a few questions to get things rolling, and then we will invite you to join in, and we'll end by 7:30. So let me just introduce Steve to you. It's a great pleasure to do this. I've known Steve for a very long time. I remembered that we met when we were both graduate students. I was at UC Berkeley, he was at Yale. So this was quite many years ago. There was an AHA, American Historical Association meeting in San Francisco, and a mutual friend of ours brought him to dinner at our house. And since then, I have admired greatly the important contributions that Steve has made to the history of slavery and emancipation, populism, the American South, the American Empire, and many other topics. I'm just going to touch on a few highlights. Steve's first book, which was based on his Allens Nevins Prize-winning PhD dissertation, was called The Roots of Southern Populism, Yeoman Farmers and the Transformation of the Georgia Upcountry, 1850 to 1890. And it won the Frederick Jackson Turner Award from the Organization of American Historians as the best book, first book in U.S. history in 1983. That book was followed by A Nation Under Our Feet, Black Political Struggles in the Rural South from Slavery to the Great Migration, which won both the Bancroft Prize and the Pulitzer Prize for History in 2004. Steve's next book, The Political Worlds of Slavery and Freedom, was published in 2009, and it was based on the 2007 Nathan Huggins lectures that he gave here at Harvard. So we know you've been here before. And next was A Nation Without Border, the United States and the World in the Age of Civil Wars, 2016. And finally, his most recent book, published in 2024, Illiberal America and History, which is, and this is the book here. And this is the book that I think is inspiring what he will share with us this evening. I'll just mention one more thing. In addition to Steve's impressive scholarly writing and his success as a teacher at NYU, where he's been since 2016, and in the schools he taught in before that, he's been, where he was a very successful teacher, he's been involved in a number of public history and humanities projects that have helped to bring history out of the university classroom into the larger world. And most recently, he has been teaching in NYU's prison education program, which offers courses and associate degrees to incarcerated students. So now please join me in welcoming Steve back to Harvard.
Well, thank you for that rare and over generous introduction. And thank you all for being here. I understand, of course, on the eve of spring break, so even though the weather is not quite cooperating. I really appreciate the invitation to come here and to talk about the current political situation in historical context as best as we can. Of course, there's no one way of doing that, but I will try to, in less than 45 minutes, try to sort of sketch out some ways that I've been thinking about as I was in the process of writing Illiberal America, which came out about a year ago, but required a pretty extensive reflection on how we think about the American past and how that might help us understand where we currently are. We live today, as we all know, in a very perilous time, and we stand on especially perilous ground, which we've come to recognize. Universities like Harvard are in the crosshairs of the current, I would call it, regime in the making, and of course, of the radical right more generally. Some of you doubtless heard J.D. Vance's proclamation, actually a couple of years ago, about how universities are the enemy. This is somebody who would probably be scratching a living had it not been for Ohio State University and Yale Law School, but nonetheless is turning the lasers on us. The vulnerabilities know no boundaries, really. Anyone on campus, students, faculty, and staff, especially as we know political activists and international students, Mahmoud Khalil being the most recent example, but unfortunately, probably the first, as the president said, the first of many. And the entire research project of the university has been belittled and set for, and the word to be used is destruction. And presidents and administrators have been basically ducking for cover or bending the knee. And I'm sure all of you are, most of you are familiar with the really important piece that Professors Brown and Johnson recently published in the Harvard Crimson, which takes aim at that and emphasizes the importance of resistance, recognizing that rolling over only makes the job easier. Now, this, of course, is not the first time universities have been under siege. Certainly in the early phases of the Cold War, and especially during the 1950s, we call it the McCarthyite era, but it was much broader than that, involved Democrats as well as Republicans, where faculty and others were fired, blacklisted, required to take loyalty oaths. Later on during the Vietnam War, a lot of the public was increasingly disenchanted with what was going on at universities, although the institutions more broadly tended not to be blamed. And then in the 1980s, it was really the first round of what we've come to call the culture wars, being waged by people like Dinesh D'Souza and Laura Ingraham, who, this was their springboard into greater notoriety, I should say. Right-wing newspapers being published on college campuses, broad attacks on the very idea of legal education, and especially on affirmative action, gay rights, and all sorts of programs that were designed to make the university and make liberal arts education available to larger numbers of people who had, traditionally been left out. Recent years, of course, the attacks have been ratcheted up and have been fortified by billionaire donors. Back in the day, if you gave a lot of money, you got to slap your name on a building. Now it seems that you can claim the right to surveil instruction and the faculty. It seems to me that this is part of a likely process of ethnic and political cleansing, not only for the humanities, but certainly focused on that. Now, the placing of the universities in the current regime's enemies list, I think, is part of a through line of the past almost 2 months now, because attacks have been launched on institutions and groups who compose a base of potential independence and opposition, on institutions and programs that tie people to the federal government, an effort to weaken politically and economically the positions of people of color, whether they're immigrants or not, and the deployment of expulsion, a very long-standing American tradition, as an appropriate method of repression, not only for undocumented people, but for activists and those regarded as political enemies, for federal employees, for those who are accused of being hired under DEI or enabling DEI, members of the press and social media. Expulsion. It's unclear what the investigations that will likely be conducted against those who were involved in the January 6th investigations and others that involved Donald Trump. But my fear is that they will soon be labeled enemies of the people, and maybe the Democratic Party along with it. Now, there's no question that in its speed and scale, we are witnessing something, I believe, that at least at the national level of politics is probably unprecedented. I do not believe it's unprecedented at the state and local levels. And it has led to constant exasperation about the so-called norms that are being violated. This struck me as early as 2015, 16, when Trump began his candidacy for presidency. And, many people in the media were just aghast at one thing after another. It seems to me that the idea of norms itself being violated shows the power of what is usually called a liberal tradition. The idea that American history is largely organized around the set of ideas and practices that involve rights, civic inclusiveness, involve representative institutions, democratic methods of selection, the rule of law, the separation of powers, the acceptance of the outcome of elections. Now, one of the things that was so surprising to me in 2015-16, it was as if everything was going swimmingly up until that point. But ever since at least the mid-1990s, all sorts of things were going on in the political world that was suggesting that these so-called liberal norms or liberal democratic norms were on very shaky ground to begin with, or were being violated on a regular basis. The Supreme Court had already intervened in a presidential election, at the first possible notice and decided the outcome. It had turned on the spigot of big money in politics. It had gutted voting rights, and this was before Dobbs. As a result, state legislatures across the country took the first opportunity to raise the bar for participation in political life, which of course hit the poor and people of color the hardest, as it was intended to do. There was the rise of white nationalist influence on the Republican Party. I would just remind you that in the late 1980s, the neo-Nazi and Klansman David Duke not only was elected to the state legislature in Louisiana, but he ran for the Senate and the governorship, came very close to winning the Senate race, and on all occasions won nearly 60% of the white vote. A few years later, Pat Buchanan talked about launching a culture war, celebrated white nationalism, and told the Republican Party to pay heed to someone like David Duke because he really demonstrated a way forward and many of the weaknesses that the Democratic Party and liberalism more generally had. It was in this period the explosion of mass incarceration, which coincided not simply with the Reagan and Bush administrations, but with the Clinton administration, which not only expelled people from their communities, but really expelled people from political life. It's not simply that, except for a couple of states, people who are incarcerated can't vote, but in most places they can't vote not only when they're released, but until their parole is completed and they have finished paying all their debts back to the state, which can be very considerable. And so all of this is going on, and somehow or other, Trump is being responded to as if, the American political system was, for the most part, worked very well. The liberal tradition, in fact, is not a long-standing perspective on American society and American history. It is an invention of the 1940s and 1950s. Beforehand, historians never talked about American development that way. They talked about the important influence of Europe and European institutions, about an Anglo-Teutonic kind of miasma. And then, of course, there was a progressive interpretation of history, which was about conflict. You could call it class conflict, some did, but it was about the people versus the interests. This hung on for a long time, for multiple decades, until the 40s and the 50s, when the idea of a liberal tradition was born. And what's so interesting about it to me is that it has hung on for a long time with great tenacity, despite the fact that it was bludgeoned within a few years of its emergence. And critics were coming at it from all sorts of perspectives. People who were interested in African American history, who were interested in class and working class history, who were interested in women's history, who were interested in Native peoples, and so on and so forth, which the liberal tradition and the writers, Hartz, Hofstadter, many others, some were critics, others were celebrated it, had. So instead, what I'd like to suggest, and I'll take the remaining time I have, is to suggest that what we're seeing is not the shakiness of the liberal tradition or defections from it, but rather the powerful eruption of a very deeply rooted illiberalism. They can be traced back to the 17th century, that was tethered in important ways to early modern and feudal worlds, and then had an extended life and to this day. It has emerged over time in numerous social and cultural forms. It became modernized. It adopted new languages and new targets. But I will say there were a number of characteristics that one can see again and again. And let me mention a number of these characteristics. And they'll help us understand a lot of what is going on at the moment. One is a belief in inherent inequalities, inequalities that are civil, political, and social. A belief in what you might call assigned or ascribed hierarchies of gender, race, and nationality. A quest for cultural and or religious homogeneity or uniformity. The marking of internal and external enemies, and the use of exclusions and expulsions as a means of defeating them. And this, of course, means the centrality of political violence as a way of both attaining and maintaining power, and privileging the will of the community, however that community may be defined. And of course, community is a very ambiguous concept, but privileging the will of the community over the rule of law. Now, we can see the illiberal eruptions on many occasions in different places, as you could well imagine. But when I was writing Illiberal America, I was interested not in digging up the worst stuff to be found, and there was plenty of that, but actually looking episodically at those moments in the past that they're not the darkest on the surface, but that were more likely associated with the rise and development of liberalism, and to try to unpack what was going on and to interrogate the sort of what was looked at and what wasn't looked at. And so what I'd like to do is just sort of mention a few of these examples as a way of, maybe constructing a discussion too. Let's start with the 1960s. Now, this, of course, is generally seen as sort of the salad days of modern liberalism, the Great Society, the enactment of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, a variety of rights movements. But it's also a time, and this is oftentimes ignored, uh, partly because in 1964, Barry Goldwater got drugged. And so many people, including people like Richard Hofstadter, someone who was really interested in the radical right, thought that was the end, that the Republican Party and the conservative movement had kind of run out of gas. But from the point of view of the energized radical right, it was the beginning that Barry Goldwater represented a shift in the Republican Party from the East Coast and its international wing to the West Coast and a variety of new perspectives. This is a time with the emergence of the John Birch Society is founded in the late 1950s, the Young Americans for Freedom were organized in 1960 at Bill Buckley's estate in Connecticut. And I think maybe more important than anything else, as a kind of example of what's going on and what we could easily miss, is the rise of George Wallace. Now, as many of you know, George Wallace was elected governor of Mississippi in 1962, and he gave just horrific inaugural address talking about segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Martin Luther King regarded him as the worst racist in the entire country. But it turns out that he ran for president on 3 occasions. One time in 1964. Now, this is shortly after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Lyndon Johnson had just become president, and he decided he was making a tour of college campuses outside of the South. And it was very clear even then that he had an audience that he could speak to. And in 1964, he ran in 3 primaries in the North, Wisconsin, Indiana, Maryland, and won about a third of the vote before he dropped out. In 1968, he organized his own party, and for a while, it looked as though he was going to win enough electoral votes to throw the entire election into the House of Representatives, where, even if he didn't win, it would be something of a kingmaker, as he recognized. What he managed to do was to hone a language of grievance and of racial hostility that seemed to have a great deal of appeal to white constituencies in the urban North, in the rural North, out West. In 1972, before he was sidelined by an assassin's bullet, he had already won primaries, running for the Democratic nomination there. It's not entirely clear what would have happened to that year had it not been for him. This still resonates with us, and I think if you want to look at the more recent sort of early signs of what we're seeing now and the kind of mobilization that has taken place in the last 10 years, he's definitely someone to look at closely. We can think, moving back a little further, of the progressive era, which we tend to associate with the birth of modern liberalism. But if you look at this, it was a very great attraction to social engineering across the progressive spectrum that showed itself in fascination with eugenics, scientific breeding, and with immigration restriction tethered to that. It's fascination with segregation, which was embraced by progressives all over the country who saw this really as the modern way to choreograph race relations, as opposed to the violence that was exploding and ensued in the South. And of course, Plessy versus Ferguson puts the stamp of the Supreme Court on it. Fascination with the disfranchisement not only of African Americans, but of recent immigrants who, as Herbert Crowley, one of the most noteworthy professors would put it, didn't seem to understand the national purpose, and therefore American politics should really be in the hands of people who were educated in this, who were professionals, and so on. And of course, Williams versus Mississippi was an example of the Supreme Court validating that. This is an age of American imperialism and warfare, an effort to extend American values overseas, to tutor people of color, whether they're in the Caribbean or in the Philippines, who it seemed were unable to govern themselves. But it built on the conquest of the North American continent. One of the things that's so interesting about this is that officers and troops who were in the Philippines had been involved in Indian wars in the Trans-Mississippi West, and they kind of likened their experience in the Philippines to what was going on in the West. The suppression of backward people who couldn't take care of themselves and who were undermining the American project more generally. There's an alliance of government and corporations, especially during the First World War, and the eventual repression of political radicals at that time. In many ways, I would suggest anticipating European fascism of the 1920s. And indeed, a lot of this came to fruition in the United States in the 1920s. The Ku Klux Klan was probably the largest social and political movement in the country, targeting Jews and Catholics, as well as people of African descent. America Firstism burst on the scene, religious fundamentalism, and an enormous admiration of early fascism, especially in Italy, especially Mussolini, until the Italians invaded Ethiopia. So up until that point, look, eugenics was connecting scientific research in the United States and in Nazi Germany, and Joseph Mengele got a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation to do his work. So, I think this is an important thing to recognize. We can think, moving back a little bit too, of the Jacksonian period, which is associated with the rise of American democracy. It's also a period of mass expulsions. Now, of course, the best known and some of the most horrific involve the expulsion of Native peoples from their lands east of the Mississippi out to something called Indian Territory in the West, where there is no expectation that it would ever become a state. In the Union, it's not entirely clear when it even was. But it also involved the expulsions of free Black people, of Catholics, of Mormons, of abolitionists. The 1830s was a period of mob violence so extreme that Abraham Lincoln and Alexis de Tocqueville commented on it and worried about the future of the country and whether mob rule was really taking hold rather than a rule of law. There's the rise of the first mass nativist movement that coincides with the immigration of large numbers of rural Irish Catholics, which was not restricting immigration, but was focused on limiting the civil and political rights of those who came. And the social reform impulse of the period, included advocacy of the penitentiary. Now, one of the interesting things about this is among the leaders and among the architects of the penitentiary, which included the acceptance of convict labor and corporal punishment, were people who were deeply involved in the anti-slavery movement. They didn't see really any contradiction necessarily. I mean, this is something when I've taught in the recruitment education program I have, my students read Benjamin Rush, who is a really interesting figure, and who, as a physician and as a enlightened figure and its important political person, had a really moral denunciation of what are called slave keeping, but also held up the penitentiary as the humane alternative to traditional forms of punishment. We can think, moving back a little bit, and I won't move back any further than this, to the revolutionary and constitutional era that did produce a framework for a republic, but oftentimes ignored is a powerful anti-Catholicism that had long been part of the political culture of England. Uh, Long-term attachments to monarchy and to hierarchical forms of authority, deep worries about popular democracy, especially the 1780s, which showed up in the Constitution, and of course, a central support both for slavery and rewards for enslavers. Now, what I'd like to just kind of finish with is uh, sort of like why might it be useful to think about illiberalism as something that is powerful and serious, that ought to be considered, and and uh, and what it can get us. And I think it's important for a number of reasons. For one thing, I think it helps us understand what's out there and what we're up against. You know, there's a tendency to describe the behaviors of many people on the right, or many people who vote for those on the right, who seem to be supportive of right-wing policies, as a backlash, or as small p populism, which I have to confess, as a historian of populism, really irritates me. Because, you know, people who are called populists never consider themselves, they don't talk about themselves as populists. It's basically a derogatory term. And this, I think, is a response that is embedded in an idea of a liberal tradition as being a centerpiece of American history and politics. The idea is that the diversions from it are little more than rage-filled and generally irrational. And that's what we look at people like that. And it's usually ascribed to working people or the lower classes, or to those who are regarded as or undereducated. I mean, how do we talk about the so-called white working class? In American political analysis, the only time we really talk about class, well, the two times. One is to talk about the middle class, and one is to use class as really an epithet. And in terms of the white working class, which no one is very clear about defining, except that they seem to lack a college degree. Now, this, of course, is true for probably 60% of the adult population in the United States, including, many people who are billionaire oligarchs. That's a particular point. It's not very helpful. What we're seeing, but it does suggest that what's happening is really without substance. And in some ways, although it's a comforting thought, and I think especially in 2016-17, that it was especially comforting because it was this kind of idea that what happened in that year was a fluke, that it was a noxious weed growing in an otherwise, fertile democratic soil, and all we needed to do was kind of pluck it out, and we could return to some kind of normalcy. Now, obviously, we no longer are as optimistic about that. What we're seeing is not without substance. It's not, I believe, simply rage-filled. I think it taps into deep perspectives, practices, and understandings, entire worldviews that, of course, are international in scope. And one of the things we obviously need to recognize is that we are in a worldwide illiberal moment that may be longer than that, maybe era, that is going to be very consequential for how we're going to think about what happens in the United States. Now, I will say that it seems to me that the sort of the liberalism and how it manifests itself politically is historically contingent. It's not set in stone. It does change. And politics is volatile. And people who find themselves in one place politically at one point can find themselves in other places. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting is that if we look at the history of American socialism, in the, basically from the late 1890s into the 1940s, one of the areas that was strongest was in the midsection of the country, from Texas and Louisiana to Oklahoma and Kansas and the Dakotas. If not socialism, then social democracy. One of the things for us to figure out is how the red states became the red states, right? And what it now obviously it has to do with a lot of things, including population migration and so on. But there's a question about whether there is a way of thinking about traditions that are deeply set there that we're not very aware of that did influence these. I mean, Milwaukee had socialism there into the 1940s. So, the Nonpartisan League, the Farmer Worker Party, which is still around in Minnesota, I mean, this is an important perspective on what's going on. But it may be historically contingent, but it is powerful and serious nonetheless, and strengthened, at least in this country, as most elsewhere, by decades of mobilization by the right, which took on an increasingly neoliberal cast, but I think ended up effectively constructing an entire political culture that has been so encompassing that it's become bipartisan and that it seems like it's always been with us. It is a political culture that, of course, celebrates the individual, the market, accumulation, the protection of property, especially certain kinds of property, law and order, and the admiration of economic elites and oligarchs. And at the same time, it's a political culture that has come to demonize the state initiatives that are directed toward achieving equality, the state's perceived clients, social welfare and safety nets, intellectual and artistic life, which has been going on for a long time, but they're feeling it much more powerfully at the moment, educators and public educational institutions in general. I think one of the things this suggests is that the task that lies ahead is about challenging this political culture. And it's not as if that's the only thing that's ever been out there. Between the 1930s and the 1960s, probably the only era in American history that you could call somewhat social democratic was a very different one with a very different set of sensibilities. And the point is not to go back, but to actually expand, to build upon the sort of commitments, loyalties, and senses of obligations to each other that were there to build a vision of the future that weakens illiberalism, because it has been weakened and it can be weakened, but it is there and it's not simply going to disappear. And I think that's important to recognize. Taking illiberalism as a powerful force does one more thing, and I'll finish with this. It de-centers liberalism from the American historical narrative. Now, by that I mean not simply diminishes it, because liberalism is a very, very powerful and changing force in its own right. But my sense is that the centrality of the liberal tradition in American historical thinking, even for those who have taken, set their sights on it and inflicted massive damage on it as an interpretive orientation, nonetheless kind of sees many developments in relationship to it. And as a result, I think blinds us to a range of political ideas and movements that have in fact shaped our past and that indeed need to be excavated and which may have owed nothing to either illiberalism or liberalism, even if eventually these currents kind of ran over and through them. I mean, just to mention a few, popular democracy cooperativism, radical abolitionism, anti-monopoly, and yes, populism of the 19th and early 20th centuries, socialism and social democracy, Black nationalism and feminism, industrial unionism and syndicalism, and gay rights, to name just a few. Um, and so I do think that that in some important ways, the significance of the multiplicity of political traditions that have been really significant in American history and that have really driven a whole variety of important social movements um, has tended to be overlooked if they can't be sort of connected to the liberal tradition or what has, in recent decades been what you might call a slavery to freedom narrative, which is, we sinned in the past, but little by little, we have kind of redeemed ourselves of this. I mean, it reached probably the apogee when Barack Obama was elected president, and for 5 minutes, you can talk about living in post-racial society. But on the 6th minute, it was pretty clear that that was over. History is, of course, in part about continuities, but it's also about change. And I think one of the things we've learned is that big changes come from the efforts of ordinary people, and oftentimes those who had been excluded, those who had been forgotten, and those who have been, or at least their attempts to expel them, and who are likely to be most committed to the goals and to the values that we claim to extol.
For a really fascinating talk, and I think put into 45 minutes many of the arguments made in this book, which I highly recommend to you. You have certainly made a convincing case in the book in particular, and in shorthand here in the talk, that the U.S. has faced many moments, forces and faces of illiberalism. There, you leave with us with no question that American culture, society, and politics has been very much influenced by this strain of illiberalism. But as in the book in particular, you point, when you go from one of these sort of key moments to another, you point to particular stimuli that you argue have inspired the rise of it. So when you talk about the strides that were made, for example, by African Americans after the Civil War and during Reconstruction are met with the rise of the KKK. The influx of immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe at the turn of the century, many of them Catholic, encourages nativism and eugenics. You talk about how the rise of communism with the Soviet Union leads to the Red Scare after World War I, and then with Soviet expansion after World War II into Eastern Europe with McCarthyism. So without so forcing you into sort of a too specific a ranking, I just wonder what you think are the most important precipitating factors in this most recent rise of authoritarianism, anti-democracy, intense culture wars, and so forth. Because we do want to try to understand better what's going on in our world today. And I'll just kind of remind us of some of the arguments that are sort of circulating out there about how to explain what's behind what's happening now. One is the racial argument, which you pointed to. At base, an attack against racial progress, perceived unfairness of affirmative action for whites, election of Obama, Black Lives Matter, as well as the influx of brown immigrants from the global South. Other critics would add to that it's also rejection of second wave feminism and the progress of gay marriage, focusing here on issues of gender and sexuality. We've heard a lot about cultural resentments. such as the Middle America rejecting the lifestyle, the cosmopolitan values, the arrogance of the coastal elites, us. There's then a very important, more economic argument that you do engage with in the book. And here I would point to Gary Gersel's recent book on the rise of neoliberalism, that really it's neoliberalism and the globalization that comes out of it, followed by the Great Recession of 2008 and 9, that's been a key stimuli for this really extreme right-wing turn. The unusual part about that argument is that those behind it represent, I think, a strange alliance between working class and lower middle class people experiencing sort of a shrinking share of national wealth and stalled intergenerational mobility, rejecting policies like NAFTA and so forth, them on the one side, and then on the other side, these high tech and high finance, many of the billionaires who are anti-state, anti-regulation, anti-tax. So I'm just sort of wondering, laying out those racial, cultural, gender, economic arguments, how you would prioritize, or you think it's just a gestalt of this sort of political culture that you refer to at the end of the talk?
Well, that's a very big question. First of all, I think we need to learn a lot more about looking at the contemporary situation, about the social profile and dynamics of the right wing. And I have long been suspicious of the talking about the white working class as the basis of this. First of all, white working people behave politically in a whole variety of ways, as numerous studies have shown. It seems to me that probably the driving force tends to be those who were connected with the Tea Party movement after Obama was elected and started up when he was inaugurated. They were out there, and here you're looking at people who are educated but who are Christian fundamentalists and nationalists, people who were more likely to be sort of middling types, small business people, contractors, people who were very vulnerable to shifts in the economy and who were dependent on working people and who had, tight profit margins and therefore were very anti-union and very tough on labor questions. But I do think that sort of the large context here has to do with something that was happening in a broad, international environment, which was the deindustrialization of Europe and North America. It has to do with the shriveling of the kind of social welfare state that was being built all over Europe, and especially in some areas rather than others. It had to do with the enormous migrations that empire and the decolonization ended up producing, as suddenly countries that were always looking at the United States as the most racist society in the world were beginning to experience their own problems with it. Also, I think the sort of pulling out and sort of mobilizing around and this is connected to sort of Christian fundamentalists with a sort of a view of family and community, patriarchy, suspicions, obviously opposition to feminism, opposition to the rights movements in general. And I think there is kind of a particularist sense of rights that has long been part of American history, which means, you can have your rights there, but you're not going to have your rights here. And you could see this obviously even in housing issues in large cities that preceded oftentimes there's, they look at the explosions, the rebellions of the 1960s, but this was happening in the late 40s and 1950s as, the Black urban population in northern cities was expanding, as a housing shortage was, as well as anyone, was bedeviling a lot of these places. I think a large shift in the political economy of sort of industrial societies, the weakening of the sort of social democratic impulse and the sort of social welfare states that were being built, less so in the United States, but nonetheless, and I mean, that's what I would, I think it's a cultural, political, and of course, an economic issue. It's all of these things. And I don't think we can see, it's not like the same thing repeats itself. I mean, I do think that at a whole variety of moments, there are different things that are involved. I mean, as you pointed out, the end of the 19th century is a time of immense social and political conflict, a sense that the kind of competitive and sort of economically liberal world of the 19th century was um, unequipped to deal with modernity. And I don't think it's a surprise that, you see, responses, anti-liberalism all over anti-19th century liberalism all over the place. And I do think that because we kind of attach ourselves to a view of progressivism as largely a liberal phenomenon, with its unfortunate excursions into racism and imperialism, that I think there's really connecting tissue. And I have to say that I think eugenics has, in most studies of progressivism, not been given sufficient attention. I remember when I was reading the minutes of a big, actually, Margaret Sanger organized it in New York. It was a birth control convention. But, there was a lot of talk about eugenics. And if you saw the people who were there, it was like a who's who of American political and intellectual life who were really drawn to this and to the whole idea, of social engineering, that may not be all in a kind of sort of right illiberal direction, but it was very powerful. And it just seemed to me that, this is something that we needed to take seriously. And I thought that this was kind of a way in which illiberalism was itself being modernized for a world that was changing. I mean, it's, you had,
We can go
the
on
so big.
Right.
And then there was another thing.
Okay. So let me ask you another question. Fortunately, historians don't predict the future. That's to our benefit. And also granted that history never will play out exactly the same way. But I wonder what you have learned from looking at these past moments of kind of illiberal frenzy that we're sort of living in now as well, how long they last and how they end. Since, we kind of would be really helpful to know how long we're going to suffer. So what has worked? What has worked best? I mean, seriously, sort of analytically, what kinds of things have worked best to beat back these sort of hyper illiberal moments? Institutions like courts, which we're now depending on a great deal. Social movements, you kind of suggested that at the end of your talk. What have, even when courts in fact act, one of the things we're worried about today, and I wonder if there are historical precedents, how can they really make executives respond and implement the decisions that they make? Are there any precedents we can look to? Can you present us with a case of an illiberal moment that actually came to an end and how it did?
No. Well, first of all, I don't happen to think that there's any kind of not that you were asking this. There's any kind of pendulum that we could move to one side, then kind of things swing back, which itself is sort of a comforting idea that if we can just endure this for another few years, that somehow, I don't think that's the case at all. I think it's also important, depressing to recognize that if you look at the American past, it's basically been a very conservative one, except for, if I mean, the real moments that made a difference were explosive ones from below. They were ones as during the revolutionary period about the organization of artisans and working people in cities and small property owners in the countryside. Certainly during the middle of the 19th, and then of course African American abolitionists who were so important in driving the anti-slavery movement in a direction that eventually not only began to put an end to slavery outside of the southern states, but eventually made possible the mass emancipation. But that itself, would never have happened had it not been the activism of enslaved people. Otherwise, one of the things that people don't recognize is that at the beginning of the civil, I prefer calling it the War of the Rebellion, but the Civil War, if someone thought about what, how slavery might end in the United States, it would be gradually, because that's the way it ended in the Northeast and Middle Atlantic. I mean, there was no, a sense that that was tethered to an idea that people who were enslaved were not ready for freedom, and therefore, emancipation brought disorder along with it, and somehow or other gradualism, which was the case in many other slave societies in one form or another, would be necessary. But we're talking now about the 14th Amendment and birthright citizenship. I mean, had it not been for the activism of enslaved people, the war would not have ended the way it did. Slavery would not have ended the way it did. It would be no 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, or 15th Amendment, all no civil rights bill. And so, that was an incredible moment, but it didn't, and it had its, version in the South and in parts of the North. But certainly in the 1930s, it seems to me that the mobilizations that took place partly explain why there was no fascism in the United States. But I do think that for the most part, the courts have been very conservative wherever you look. On the lower levels, they've pretty much done the work of employers in crushing labor unrest, certainly all the way up to the Supreme Court. They, except for the Warren Court, they played mostly a role in limiting rights and protecting property and expanding ideas about, who in fact was covered by the 14th Amendment, substantive due process and things like that. And so I do think that, looking back and somehow thinking that, there's a multiplicity of sort of political episodes that swing between so-called liberal and conservative, or however you want to put it, is probably not the case at all. In 1968, we think about that presidential election, very, very close. But if you combine Nixon's vote and Wallace's vote, it was 57% of the population. I just think we need sort of to understand that, and the periods of time when you could talk about real sort of change was coming from social movement. So I'm a little less. I mean, at this point, there's kind of, for reasons that are completely understandable, an idea and interest in defending American institutions as best as possible, because they seem to be, one among the few forms of stability to be found. Although I have to confess, having ever since 2017 and turning on even like MSNBC and seeing the FBI and the CIA and the national security state regarded as our friends, I think is really weird. And I think one of the things is true is that people on the left have not developed much of a foreign policy perspective at all, at least since, the kind of end of the Vietnam War and, national, decolonization struggles and so on and so forth. And so, we're living in a moment now where, of course, NATO, which 2 decades or 3 decades ago we would have looked on with some suspicion, is now, along with any kind of institution that we can find. And, we're talking about, things being wrecked. And I'm not minimizing the importance, because I do think that the goal is to destroy as much as possible, to weaken people who are dependent, or I don't mean dependent in a negative way, but who depend on the resources of the federal government for their own personal stability and prosperity. I mean, you fire federal employees. What does that mean? I mean, that's clearly, targeting people of color who are disproportionately, represented there. So I think there is I think that the destruction is awful, and I don't know how long it'll take to rebuild, or whether there's going to be much interest in rebuilding it, until, of course, people don't get their social security checks. And but even so, I'm dubious about the argument that, as soon as they realize that the price of eggs is going to be what it is, or inflation is going to be what it is, or the stock market is going to collapse as much, that somehow they'll realize that, they may, or that enough people are being fired. I think it will brew discontent, but I'm not convinced that it will be the source of really mobilizing against what's going on. And it just seems to me that at the moment, social movements are very fractured. There's a lot of stuff going on out there, but they're not interconnected. And until that begins to take place, and look, at this particular point, it's going to be dangerous for anyone to do it, and for anyone to get out into the streets and protest, because the army is going to be called out and they're going to shoot. And Kent State was a long time ago, but was kind of an indication of what happens when you put troops on the ground with live ammunition, and who may feel that they are expected to maintain order that way. So I don't believe, I'm getting old, and my fear is that maybe I won't see things getting, changed while I'm still with us. But I'm not saying I won't. But and I don't feel that it's hopeless. And I know anyone who studies history seriously knows that, hopelessness is not about history. Sometimes it's hopelessness, sometimes it's continuity, but change does happen. Usually people who seek change don't get everything they want. Sometimes they don't get a lot of what they want, but they change the landscape. And I think that's what we need. I think we need the shift in the cultural political landscape, so people can see an alternative way of thinking about the society that they live in. And at this particular point, I don't think it's out there.
So I'm going to open it up, but I just want to say one point of hope. You dismissed the courts as totally conservative. I just want to remind us that there have been a few progressive high points. Brown v. Board, Roe v. Wade. It's true we're still trying to defend them, but it's not completely an open.
No, I said except for the board.
Right. Okay. I have a question here and then there, or measure. We're going to go for it.
I'm Don Goldman. I was a history major here in what you call the salad days. And I'll just mention that we had more people on the street protesting the cutting down of sycamore trees on Memorial Drive than we have in the street today, trying to free Khalil. So when you talked about fear, guns, and all, that resonates with those salad days where people went to the streets and took the chance. So, but what I really want to talk about and get your opinion. It was a great talk. It's provocative, which is what a good talk should be. I'm uncomfortable with the dichotomy of liberal and illiberal. First of all, illiberal is pejorative. It implies that it's against liberal and it's ill. And it doesn't capture the intolerance of that strain in American history. And it tends to get us to categorize things that are abominable, as well progressives did that. And I'm going to ask you specifically about eugenics. We are sitting in the seat of eugenics. Harvard was the world intellectual leader in eugenics. The president of Harvard was a eugenicist. And I'll tell you, he was no freaking progressive. He was a racist. And he hated Jews. And he was intolerant. And he epitomizes what is euphemistically called illiberalism. So is there a way to frame this that captures the essence of what truly non-liberal strain of American history is versus liberal and progressive?
What?
I'm trying to be provocative.
But I think it's a good question still. And I do think what I was interested in discussing political current that was that went way back and was both close to the surface but deep as well. Now, I think there is a problem with using the term illiberal because I argue in the book, and I think that this precedes liberalism. So maybe there's a better concept, but I did think that it does capture the the racism, intolerance, and to try not to simply see it as kind of negative variations on liberalism, that it had a life of its own, that it was capable of being kind of excavated and sort of energized. And, I think the question you raise, suggests some of the, ways in which that there might be limitations to using. I mean, the categories, I think you're right. You don't want to fit things into neat categories. I don't think any of the categories are neat. And I think that one of the things that's characteristic of politics and political culture is a lot of volatility. And you can't necessarily expect that certain people will always behave in X kind of way. So it's contextual too.
Yeah, I think it sanitizes the situation by using those terms.
One thing I want to say, we just had.
Identify yourself, so
What's that?
just give your name.
Oh, yeah, I'm John Trumpor, Research Director of the Center for Labor and Just Economy at Harvard Law School. I just want to mention, we just had over 200 people at 4:30 p.m. protesting.
Yeah, I saw them.
Yeah, but I think that was a reasonable turnout. I think you're being a little tough on us. We could do better. But I wanted to ask two-part question. I want to hear a little bit about, because it's such a part of your life, prison education programs and what you think is going to happen with those. And I want to then direct it to the question of the politics of crime and illiberalism in the United States, because you mentioned Clinton, 1.3 million people in prison when he was elected, 2.1 million when he finished. We had William Weld, I remember Chomsky and Howard Zinn, they were teaching in my program, and they said, we got to vote for Weld because we got to stop the illiberal silver. And then Weld eliminated prison education programs. And I just want to say one defense of George Wallace, if that's possible in Harvard. George Wallace, very late in his life, was very apologetic about what he had done. You never see a Trump person apologize ever. And I just remember the Village Voice in the 80s when I was living in New York had an article saying, it's very shocking that Ed Koch, our mayor from the liberal Silk Stocking district, has much more reactionary views on race than George Wallace does today. And so, yeah, so it's a little bit, I'm addressing a little bit the center left and the war on crime, because it's always written about as a right-wing project. But anyway.
Let me see if I can answer that briefly. First of all, I think mass incarceration can only be understood as a bipartisan project where crime and race and disorder were interconnected. Although the idea of the black body as a criminal body goes way, way back to the end of slavery and to the early emancipations outside of the South. I think one of the things that's happened is just as, the sort of what's happened to Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, we had a moment not that long ago when it appeared as though things were moving in a different direction. And certainly, even among conservatives, there was kind of the sense that mass incarceration, was a problem to be taken on. My fear now is that things are moving in an entirely different direction, and that incarceration and expulsion, which effectively incarceration is going to be a solution, to large-scale problems, and is going to, involve a lot of people. So I worry about the detention centers and so on and so forth. So, I think I worry that these programs, which have had, really very good outcomes for individual people, will be in danger, and that the public concern about what it means to live in a society where there's no other place in the world where a larger percentage of the population is incarcerated, we don't care about that anymore.
John, there's a lot in the book about that. So I think get that. Vince, you were.
Yeah, thank you. Vincent Brown. I teach here in the history department. Thank you, Steve. That was a very powerful, that was sobering reorientation in American history, but it reminded me of why, and I'm going to date us both. You were my favorite lecturer at UC San Diego in the 1980s when I was an undergraduate.
And it only dates you.
It's really nice to have you.
He was a great student.
Yeah, I'm getting better. So I want to ask you a question about, your approach to American history. When you think about the current moment, we hear a lot, especially in the political science literature, that compares the United States to other societies. Maybe it's Turkey, maybe it's Hungary, maybe it's Nazi Germany. I want to get a sense from you about why you think this more integrated approach, this more connected approach that really talks about American traditions as homegrown, kind of indigenous illiberal tradition. I know you're interested in the international dimensions of this. Why that approach may offer some more insight into what's happening now than the approach that compares different societies and their authoritarian trends?
Well, that's a great question, and I couldn't say. I mean, I do think one of the weaknesses of this book is precisely that it's a little too American focused. There are points at which I sort of acknowledge that it's not an American issue. We have to look way beyond that. But I do think that it is a problem to somehow see it as, kind of a particular kind of American development, because more and more it's pretty obvious that that's not the case, and that what happens in North America and then the United States feeds off what's going on in many places, and what happens here is oftentimes in reference to or reaction to, as think about the Haitian Revolution, think about the Paris Commune, and there's no way of getting away from that, which is why I think this America Firstism thing is kind of comes in, because it comes in at a particularly international moment following the First World War, and the idea of sort of an international approach about self-determination, perhaps on an international scale, and push back against that. So I think that a better way of thinking about this is to constantly, not so much comparative, but internationalize it. And I'm always reluctant to say this is like that. You know, where in our past is what's happening now like? And I don't really think it's like anything else, but you could say, you know, maybe closest to this, or some of the dynamics are closest to that. And I think what we can learn from is not to, you know, not to see what's, you know, just the same, but to kind of understand the sort of dynamics that bring about political outcomes. So I do think that if I had more time and energy, I think I would have liked to do this. You know, I sort of end the book with this, and you know, with a kind of sort of an international, you know, perspective, which I think there's no way of avoiding at this. I mean, you make a great mistake if you didn't recognize that. I mean, where is this not happening? But nonetheless, I think I end up focusing, and that's, you know, maybe the Trump, you know, phenomenon is something distinctive about the United States, and it's hard to find him elsewhere, but it's part of a phenomenon that's all over the place.
And I just add, in addition to, the fact that there are similar origins of mass immigration pressures and deindustrialization, there also are influences across countries. So when you've got, Hungarian leaders coming and speaking to right-wing Republicans in the United States and giving them a playbook, it internationalizes it on another level. Okay, yes.
Thank
You
you.
want to introduce yourself?
My name is David Army. I'm a freshman here at the college. Thank you for calling out, Professor. My question is, I wrote this as you were answering other questions. Is American liberalism inherently flawed if America has been, as you said, or has had, as you said, a very conservative past, and the periods of liberalism have been, or they have appeared to be, the exception and not the norm? Would liberalism then be a deviation from the natural order? Or are we simply returning to form with this recent rise of quote unquote illiberalism?
It's another big question, but I would say that, you know, in this book and my thinking, I've looked at liberalism, particularly in its kind of political iterations. It's not only that, but certainly in terms of economics and the development of what we call modern liberalism, or some people call it corporate liberalism at the turn of the 20th century, well through the 20th century. That has been a very powerful force, and in many ways it has sort of pushed conservatism, all 19th century conservatism aside. But I do think that liberalism has had all sorts of inherent problems that have to do with how do you sort of universalize, if you have any interest in doing this, so what you regard as the core values, and how do you deal with the issue of power, which I think liberals have never been particularly good at addressing, especially because they'd rather not disrupt the distribution of wealth and of political power. And somehow, as modern liberals have seen, the way you deal with it is you promote economic growth, and somehow or other that's going to expand the pie, and you don't have to think about, well, what does that mean for great disparities in the inequalities of wealth. I mean, this has been a problem. Obviously, it has become so extreme of late that it kind of blinds us to the fact that significant inequalities of wealth have always been part of American society. And there was again a period when in the 30s, when tax policy developed in such a way, and because of the Great Depression, that the sort of the great inequalities of wealth shrank a little bit, and that is also another reason to kind of look at this period, because it's certainly a time where large scale economic institutions were expected to contribute to federal revenues and so on and so forth. But I do think, it seems to me that that our past is, that what you might call, broadly speaking, a conservatism has been more powerful than I think is generally acknowledged. And I think part of it is because illiberal sensibilities and practices and ideas about these relations are not just backlashes, but they're kind of fundamentally embedded. And they get entangled. I mean, I think one of the stories is how people who are, self-regarding liberals end up doing very illiberal things because I think they are committed to maintaining order, and they don't have a very good response when disorder occurs, and they tend to fall back on certain perspectives that, liberalism, has thrived on.
I see any more hands. Yes, Harry.
Harold Chapman.
I know.
Yeah, I know. We're colleagues at NYU. This was great. I particularly was sort of moved by the argument that we underestimate the extent to which this tradition is real, and that if we write off MAGA as a kind of aberration of the uneducated and all that, it's a huge mistake. That I buy. One thought I'm having though is whether the line of argument may tend to underestimate how radical what's going on is now.
You mean the radicalism of MAGA?
Yeah.
The radicalism of the current moment, and it's too soon as a historian, it's way too soon to know what's really going on in some ways and where it's headed. But there is something profound about the difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2 is this social movement from above and below has been going on for a while, but this is the moment where they have seized the apparatus of the state. And I'm not sure that's ever happened before in the illiberal moment in the way that you've described. And that's where the analogies to interwar fascism are relevant, although you can vastly exaggerate that. But that when you start to have the state capacity, they're dismantling the state, yes, but they're also radically using the state. And when you have state capacity that we now have in the 21st century, all kinds, to be able to use that to operationalize a traditional, an illiberal tradition is a big rupture. Now maybe it'll fizzle out, but I think that part of the question of where is this going, how long it's going to last, what is the meaning of the current moment, has to take into account the seizure of the state.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I don't think there's any question about it. I think that certainly the preparation for, Trump's re-election, or however you want to put it, Project 2025, it's sort of intellectual and legal resources that went into it, a sense that, of what to do, how to move, and which is happening with, breakneck speed. I think one of the things is, I'm not really surprised by anything, but it's one thing talking about what you think might happen and watching it.
Yeah.
And that's, it's horrifying, and it's going to be more horrifying as more and more people are going to be subject, and as the state, I think you're right. This is a, takeover of the state, and like you're saying, destroying some of it, using some of it, and I'm not entirely clear where it goes, but I think it sort of suggests the formidability of what we're looking at. And I think we need to understand that we are in a new moment.
Just if I can add one of the conditions for that to have happened in the past has been the willingness of the non-radical right to align with the right. And the transformation of the Republican Party, which was a very serious, complicated operation, has enabled that, and that has broken the dam. And that also is analogous to the interwar fascist experience.
Mhm.
Again, that can change, but,
Right.
but, it's a
It
radical.
doesn't look like it's about to, and it's been developing over time. And therefore, it has all sorts of, financial support, institutional support. They've trained a couple of generations of, people who are, ready to step in. Other people who are not particularly trained to step in, but are happy to step in and to take orders about what they should do and use the power as they would see fit. So, I think that's 100% right.
And that strange alliance of, these kind of ex-manufacturing workers on the one hand and these, billionaire, high-tech, high finance people. You wonder how long does that hold? Maybe if maybe it's breaking apart is our best hope, but
Yeah, I mean, you listen to someone like Steve Bannon, who, is points to that and is very hostile to Musk and hostile to the kind of oligarchical, wealth and power. And not that what he offers up is, anything to look at. But I don't, I think part of it is to recognize that over decades, the political culture has just been captured, and it has not only been Republicans. It's been, look at the Democratic leadership council in the mid 1980s after Mondale got crushed. And I might add, Mondale was talking about industrial policy, right? I mean, that was the sort of last time we heard about that. But and about taxing wealthy people, and but I do think that the radicalism of the moment, which I think is very real, was made possible by a much longer term process of development and collapse of effective formal opposition. And I just think that what we're faced with is a opposition party that may itself be banned, or is not adequately equipped because they don't even know what's going on. And except for a few people who are standing up, who I guarantee will be marked for persecution. And I don't, then you have, so it seems to me that, some sort of social movement type thing, if possible, and it may have to develop almost in an underground way, but certainly it needs to make connections. Maybe social media will enable some of it, but people have to find each other, and they have to figure out what they share and what they want to fight for, and in some ways put aside certain differences. As a friend of mine said, not everyone can fit through in the eye of a needle, and that's a way of kind of defining, boundaries. But I don't know how effective that will be at this point, because unlike 2020, when Trump had alienated the military and he could not count on them if he wanted to call them out, he's made it sure that that's not going to happen again, and he will be able to do that because they certainly do believe in the chain of command.
well, on that depressing note, thank you. I just want to thank everyone.
Anyone for a cocktail
Thanks,
party?
thanks, Steve, for this wonderful,
Thank you all for coming out.
stimulating evening.